So, you wanna build a PC? The process is a lot easier than you might expect, even if you've never pieced together all the components that make up a typical system. Choosing the individual components for a new build deserves careful consideration, of course. The enthusiast-worthy system we're going to put together here uses parts pulled from our stash of test hardware in addition to a stack of components provided graciously by Asus and Corsair. Setting the stage. Before beginning your build, clear a large clean work area, preferably devoid of 70s era shag carpet and anything else that might induce a electrical charge. Next, gather few Q-tips, some rubbing alcohol, a fistful of zip ties, and Phillips screwdriver. The few screws we'll encounter are relatively small, so it helps to have a screwdriver with magnetic tip. Ground yourself before doing anything else. Static electricity doesn't mix well with electronic components. Any charge you might be carrying can be discharged easily by touching a large metal object. Frequent grounding is also recommended if you're wearing a static-prone fabric like polyester. Make sure the parts match. PC components are largely interchangeable. However, you can combine them. CPUs, coolers, and motherboards are designed around specific sockets. The motherboard's form factor needs to match the case too. AMD sockets are riddled with holes to accept hundreds of pins on the bottom of the CPU. Intel LGA socket worked in reverse, with the pins on the motherboard and contact pads on the base of the processor. There are different variations of AMD and Intel sockets, so make sure that your motherboard and CPU match correctly. There are three sizes of motherboard, which is ATX, Micro ATX, and Mini ATX. From left to right, you are looking at the Asus P8Z77 Deluxe ATX board. And next is the P8Z77M Pro Micro ATX. And lastly, P8Z77V Mini ATX. ATX cases can handle all three form factors. Micro ATX cases supports Micro ATX and Mini ATX boards, but it's not possible to install a board into a case meant for a smaller form factor. Installing the CPU. Some of the components are easier to install with the motherboard outside the case. Start by putting the motherboard on a flat insulated surface. First, we'll install CPU. The process is different whether you're using AMD or Intel socket. Let's start with AMD's A3850 plugged into socket FM1. FM1 socket requires little more than nudging the metal lever away from the socket and then swinging it all the way back. Find the small triangular marker in the corner of the socket. There's a corresponding mark in one corner of the CPU. Line up the two to ensure the CPU pins align correctly with the holes in the socket. Guide the CPU into the socket gingerly, ensuring the chip is fully seated, with no gap between the green rim of the CPU package and the surface of the socket. Then press down on the metal cap as you gently swing the clever back into its original position. The Intel LGA 1155 socket for our build Core i7-3770K processor is similar to operate. First, you'll need to remove the protective plastic cover from the face of the socket. This shields the underlying pins, so be careful. There should be a tab on one edge that unclaps the cap from the socket. Intel CPUs are aligned with LGA socket using indentations in the processor package. Two semicircular notches appear on the opposing edge of the processor. A corresponding pair of knobs can be found on the inner wall of the socket. Match the notches to the knobs before slowly lowering the CPU into place. After the CPU is seated properly, flip the metal frame down into the processor and then slowly swing the lever back to its original position. Make sure the teeth at the end of the frame straddle the socket anchor screw. If everything is lined up correctly, a little bit force will be required to hook the lever under the metal that locks the socket shut. Now that the CPU is installed, it needs to be prepped for the cooler. Start by cleaning the heat spreader, the metal cup covering the top of the processor. Give it a quick scrub using a Q-tip dipped in rubbing alcohol. Brush the metal cup gently to remove any particulate or oily residue that might have been deposited on the surface. Feel free to use a high concentration isopropyl alcohol or a paper towel. Just be sure you don't left behind any fibers or debris on the CPU. The stock coolers bundled with the retail boxed processor typically have a thermal interface material or TIM pre-applied to the base of the heatsink. If you don't have a separate tube of thermal paste, leave the factory coating as is. You can skip straight to installing the cooler. Folks who want to replace the stock thermal interface with another compound will first need to get rid of the original. Why bother? Because the compound applications found in the stock heatsink are typically thicker than in optimal or efficient heat transfer. The thermal compounds are used to fill tiny scratches and other surface imperfections, ensuring an unbroken physical interface between the CPU and cooler. Only a thin layer is required. The TIMs found on the stock heatsinks are fairly hardy, so some scrapping is required to remove them. Avoid using metal tools which can leave scratches in the base of the heatsink. There are different schools of thought on how to best apply thermal compound. Heatsink makers typically recommend squeezing a pea-sized dollop of the goop onto the center of the CPU's heat spreader. These days, most suggest clapping the heatsink right down on the top of the lamp. Tightening the cooler's retention mechanism will flatten the blob of compound, spreading it evenly between the CPU and the heatsink. The compound can even be spread with the finger, but you'll want to wrap the digit in a plastic bag first. Some compounds, usually the silver stuff, can stain skin and clothing. CPU coolers come in all shapes and sizes. We're going to show you a few different variations, starting with a stock AMD. AMD sockets have integrated heatsink brackets that are screwed onto the motherboard. Note the outward-facing tabs in the middle of each one. Stock AMD coolers have a metal beam that anchors the heatsink. To these tabs, one end of the beam will have a lever which should be open placed to the cooler on the CPU lining. At the ends of the beam, with the plastic tabs, hook the beam up the top, starting with the side opposite. Once the cooler is secured, plug the fan into the corresponding header on the motherboard. Use the 3 or 4 pin header marked CPU near the socket. The motherboard manual will indicate the precise location. Don't worry if the number of pins doesn't match the plug. DC fans work just fine in PWM headers. Intel stock coolers are quite different from AMD's. Instead of a mounting bracket, motherboards have 4 holes for the heatsinks anchoring post. Before the heatsink is mounted, it push pins and to be print to rotate the cup of each post counterclockwise. Tug to up to ensure the attached black pin is recessed in the post, then rotate the cups clockwise. The cup should return 90 degrees. Lower the cooler onto the socket. Post line up with the holes in the motherboard. When the cooler is resting comfortably, push the post down one at a time. Secure the pins on opposite corners of the socket first, much like you would when bolting a wheel onto a car. Pin should make an audible click when they lock into the place. To make sure the pins are secure, flip the motherboard so you should see if it is protruding black tape pushing apart the chunks, turn pieces, the anchor, the push pin, The CPU cooler plug in the fan. Stock Intel coolers typically use 4-pin PWM headers. If you need to remove the Intel cooler, rotate the post counterclockwise, pull up each one release of the socket and so through the flatted screwdriver. Stock coolers sold with AMD and processors are relatively small. The fan set on the top of the heatsink, blowing air down onto pins perpendicular to the motherboard. Aftermarket solutions are typically made up of a tall radiator that rises up from the socket with one or two fans pushing air parallel to the surface of the motherboard. Combining more surface area with greater airflow tends to produce lower temperatures and less noise. Aftermarket coolers sometimes use similar mounting mechanism to their stock counterparts, but many rely custom backplate hardware. Follow the instruction associated with the cooler. This Corsair Air 7 Series 70 is pretty typical to be the backplate sits under the motherboard and the cooler is attached to it using nuts on each corner. Remember that the fans are attached separately, which is often the case in aftermarket coolers. Since the fans blow parallel to the board, make sure that the airflow of the pointing towards a chassis. If there is no markers in the guide, most fans blow in the direction of the frame holding the rotor and the associated motor in the text covered by the grill prevent your fingers from getting munched. Cooler orientation is also important for memory compatibility with 7II. Doesn't branch out from the socket enough to overlap our motherboard DIMM slots, but one of its fans does well removed to make room of the spreaders. The Corsair Dominator memory. Most desktop systems use dual channel memory of the optimal performance. 1 DIMM per channel is required. Motherboards typically come with 4 slots or 2 per channel. If you're installing only 2 DIMMs, check the motherboard manual for guidance on which slots to use. The DIMMs configured the slots labeled A1 and B1 and then slots should be populated before installing the memory. Make sure the plastic retention tabs at the end of the DIMM slots are open. Some motherboards like Zeus P8Z77V have retention tabs only one side of the memory slots. DIMMs are keyed to fit only one way, making installation simple. Line up with a notch at the bottom of edge of the memory module with a separator near the middle of the slot. Then slide the module into place. Apply even downward pressure to both sides of the edge of the module to see if the fully in the slot sitting the memory should cause the retention tabs to swing up. Every case is different, but there are 2 predominant layouts in the world of PC towers. Traditional designs that put the power supply above the motherboard and upside downs when they do the opposite. Our Corsair or Obsidian Series 650D is an example of the latter. That's a bunch of little features that we'll have during our build, plus some actual peripherals to plug along the way. First, remove the side panels and set them aside. This case has a tool-free latching mechanism, but some enclosure requires a screwdriver for this step. The left panel exposes the main compartment, while the right panel will provide access to the backside of the motherboard tray, which is where we'll be hiding the cabling. Motherboards are mounted into the tray using a series of raised posts that line up with holes in the circuit board. The 650D has these posts pre-installed. If your case doesn't screw in the posts tightly by hand, they should be included in a bag with all the other screws. Make sure the posts match the hole pattern of the motherboard, otherwise they can short the exposed. shield is the right way around. The half dozen or circular holes for the audio jack should be on the left side towards the expansion slot covers. Some of the shield's internal tabs may block the portholes a little bit bend up the either to get in the way. Although newer cases use toll-free mechanism for the most part, PCs have traditionally relied on a series of different screws to secure the various components. We'll start with a couple of M3 screws with different caps. Note the tight thread spacing. The screw with larger heads are typically reserved from other boards and optical drives, while those with smaller heads are used with SSDs. Next to the M3 screws are a pair of 632 screws meant for hard drives, PSUs, expansion cards, and side panels. The thread spacing is much larger here. Use the small-headed screw for hard drives and larger heads for everything else. A lot of cases secure side panels and expansion cards with 632 screws that have huge thumb-friendly heads. Next to that, we have the screw used to attach case fans. Before putting the motherboard inside the case, it's worth populating the drive base. We'll start with a 3.5-inch hard drive, which will typically be affixed to rails or a drive sled that slides easily into the case. In the 650D, remove one of the sleds, flex the walls away from each other, and then place the drive between them. The knobs in the wall will line up with the screw and the side of the drive. If your case doesn't have the tool sleds, use the screw holes to affix the drive to the cage. If your rubber grommets are included in the case, use them like spacer between the drive and the cage. Rubber grommets help dampen vibration, noise, and 650D sleds have them pre-installed. In the chassis with the removable night panels, try to point the drive's connector to the right side. That's where we're going to hide the cabling. If you can't get out the right side of the cage, orient the drive so their connectors are accessible. SSDs use the smaller 2.5-inch form factor meant for notebook drives. Most newer cases have mounting holes for this size, usually on the same sled used for hard drives. 650D lets us screw the SSD on the bottom of the drive sled. Don't worry about grommets here. SSDs have no moving. Attach the adapter to the SSD, then put the whole thing into the 3.5-inch placement. Orient the SSD connector to match the hard drive. The 650D's drive cage sits next to the massive fan, so put the SSD and hard drive near the middle of the path of the airflow. If you don't have a fan near the cage, put the drives lower, which is usually where temperatures are cooler. Leave at least 1 day's worth of space between them. Optical drive haven't gone the way floppies just yet. Blu-ray and DVD drives slip into an external 5.25-inch base, which typically have covers that need to be removed. Our 650D case requires that the front bezel be removed before popping off the bay. Cover bezels are usually held by plastic tabs on their inside vertical edges. To press these tabs and pop off the bezels. With the bezels removed, we can pop out the cover associated with the bay we want to use. Choose the bay that's easiest to reach depending on whether your case will be sitting on the top or your disk or beneath it. Line up the bezel's plastic tab before shaping it back to slide into the optical drive until it's flush with the bezels, then flip-flop the tool latching mechanism to lock the thing's plate. Don't have a tool-free bay, secure the drive with the screws above with the 4 screw holes per side. Use at least one at the front and one at the back. Most enclosures come with at least a couple of their own cooling fans already installed. These work just fine, but you can swap it quieter or more powerful units. To show you the process, we're going to ditch the 120mm rear exhaust fan for a Corsair Air series of 120. Most cases suck in air from the front and exhaust it out of the rear at the top, so we're going to orient the fan blow outside the case. Remember that the fan direction to indicate the side of the frame. Remove the existing fan 4 screws and use them to affix the new one. If the holes in the fan don't line up and the one in the mounting joint, the fan probably isn't the right size. With the case primed, it's time to install the motherboard. Lay the case on each side so the motherboard can be lowered onto the tray depending on how much the room there is to work inside your case. The motherboard may need to be inserted at the angle with the port side. First, line up the ports with the holes in the I/O shields and let the board rest on the ports of the board may need to be nudged towards the rear of the case to line up the screw holes. Magnetic tip screwdriver really helps when guiding the screws into the pole. As with the CPU coolers, tighten the screws on opposing corners first. Should keep the bond centered. Over the post-circuit boards are more fragile than the cases. Metal panels, tighten the screw until they snap. Don't give them an extra thrust after that. Next, we start wiring the motherboard for the cleanest, largest run cable along the right side of the case behind the drive case and the motherboard tray. Never chassis should have enough routing holes to keep the cables hidden until they need to be put the connectors on the motherboard. Leave the excess wiring hanging. Well, tackle the front panel connectors first. Find the bundle of thin wires with end labeled the SW reset, the SW power LED, and HDD LED. These control the power and the reset switches plus the LEDs at the front of the case. Motherboard makers still haven't agreed on the standard layout for front panel connectors, so you'll have to consult the manual to see where wires go. They should all be plugged in a single block of pins on the board. Some boards like Zeus P8C77 come with these separate pin blocks that allows the wiring to be done outside the case. Simply attach the connector to the auxiliary block, then plug that to a motherboard. Front panel USB to firewire and audio ports use 10-pin connectors that are keyed differently to prevent insertion of the wrong header. Locate the associated headers of the motherboard and connect the front panel ports accordingly. Our system's motherboard doesn't have a firewire. We're going to skip that connector. We'll return to the panel audio sound card. That are two ways to connect the front panel USB 3 ports found in the most newer cases. The first method, USB port in the rear cluster, will thread the cables at the back of the case and into the rim ports of the blue internal differentiation. The USB 3 ports from slower USB 2 ports next to the corner the system. Similar to those employed CPU coolers, while the boards have dedicated headers for system fans typically labeled H9 or Cs, the manual will map out the location of these headers. Some fans use larger 4-pin Molex connectors. These fans need to be plugged into the power supply, which we'll install in a moment. Installing a graphics card is easy. We're going to use a Zeus HD7870 Direct CU2 top, which is a mid-range offering with a beefy dual slot cooler. Although the card plugs into only one PCI Express expansion slot, the cooler takes up 2 slots. We'll need to remove the 2 of the expansion slot covers at the back of the case to make the room of the graphics card to determine which ones to locate the primary PCI X16 slot, which is usually one of the top slots on the motherboard. Our board's top slot is a PCI Express X1, which is much shorter than the X16 slot below it. Below those two, another X1 slots, followed an old school PCI slot. Note how the PCIe and PCI slots have notches in different positions to prevent cards from being inserted incorrectly. Remove the expansion slot cover next to the X16 slot. Also remove one below it. If you have a dual slot card, lower the card into the appropriate slot and make sure the display outputs are facing the back of the case. Apply even pressure along the top edge to seat the cards. Fully secure the card to the chassis with the screw which from the expansion slot covers. If you need to remove the graphics card, be sure to release the retention tab located at the end of the slot. Other boards are different mechanism, and you might need to use a poking tool to reach the tab. To fully loaded system, you can run 2 graphics cards to improve performance. The second card is installed in the secondary PCIe Express X16 slot, ideally with some breathing room between it and the first card. Don't lack airflow of the cooler fan. Your MB should come with a short ribbon cable or circuit board meant for this purpose. Expansion cards are good for more than just graphics. We can also add sound cards, TV turners, overfast SSDs, and other goodies. We recommend sound cards to anyone with halfway decent speakers or headphones. So we're going to install a Zeus Zone RDG sound card. This card has an old school PCI interface, and installation process is similar that we went through the graphics card. Remove the appropriate expansion slot cover from the back of the case. Orient the card with a port facing the rear. Then apply pressure along the top edge of the seat and card slot. Card blocks one of the graphics card's fan. We should really move it to the lower slot. Instead of doing it, we're going to swap the Zone or DGX or a PCI Express X1 version of the DG. Our motherboard also is accessible with X1 slot between the graphics card and the processor are called. We don't want to crowd any further. We use the lowest PCI Express 16 slot on the board, which leaves plenty of room for future upgrades. PCI Express X1 cards can fit into the PCIe slot with a higher number of X1. Interface isn't long enough to activate the retention tab at the end of the slot, but screwing the back plate into the chassis will hold the card steady. Most sound cards have 10-pin headers for the front panel, headphone, and microphone jacks like the front panel USB and a firewire. The audio connector is keyed to the relay. If you're using the motherboard integrated audio instead of the discrete sound, you can find similar block pins of the board. Usually these will be loaded in the audio. Our system is nearly complete, but we still need to add a power supply. Traditional PSU have all their cabling attached, while modular ones allows user to connect only the power leads required by the system. Here we have a Corsair GS600, a traditional design, and the modular AX850. All those tentacles branching off the GS600 can complicate installation and wiring. You'll be left with a bundle of extra leads that needs to be tucked away somewhere inside the case. With a modern PSU, these extra leads can be left in a box where they won't get in the way if we prefer modular PSUs. So we're going to use the AX850. Most PSUs have bottom-mounted fans that suck air into the unit and expel it through vent at the rear. This arrangement works well traditional cases that now is the PSU above the motherboard, because the power supply ends up exhausting hot air from around the CPU in an upside-down chassis. Like our instrumentation sucks air through the vents of the case's front. That's okay to the 650D, which is removable filter to prevent dust from getting harmed. If you have an upside-down case with an unfiltered intake and will be setting the system on the floor, you probably want to flip the unit to suit the fan's orientation of the PSU can only be changed. The enclosure has the appropriate mounting holes for the flip config. A lot of them, including 650D PSUs, attach bit for mounting. Line up the holes and attach the PSU using the 632 screws included with the case. Check the manual if your setup doesn't resemble the design illustrated. The 650D has a secondary bracket that screws into the floor of the case. We'll make sure that the extra bracket is snug against the PSU before screwing the upside down case. Like the 650D tend to leave a lot of room around the PSU, making it easy to connect to the modular power leads after installation. If your chassis, most system will need 24-pin primary connectors and 4 to 8-pin auxiliary 12-volt connector. For the motherboard, graphics card require 2 6 8-pin PCI Express leads. You'll also need a SATA connectors as you have hard drives, SSDs, and optical drives. We don't need any 4-pin Molex or floppy connectors for our build, but you might require them for you. All the components are now installed, but we still need to make a bunch of connections before we fire up this system. This is where you really want to pay close attention to cleanly routing the cables through the portal surrounding the motherboard tray. If your case doesn't have a room for cabling behind the tray, try to run wires along the internal scaffolding. Most chassis have enough internal perforations or anchoring points to secure cables with zip ties. Don't start strapping the cables in place until they all connected. Attach all the drives using the serial data cables included with the motherboard, and our system will need cables for the hard drive, the SSD, and the optical drive. The SATA docking station integrated into the top of the case has its own cable attached already. SATA cables are key to connect, and only one orientation. Use the I-shaped socket as a guide for the tip of the cable. If one of these tips is at right angle, connect that end to the drive rather than to the motherboard. Connect the device one at a time to keep track of what's plugged in where. You'll want to make sure the SSDs are connected to the motherboard's 6GB per second. SATA ports. Hard drives are worth plugging into these ports too, but optical drives are too slow for it to matter. The motherboard manual should identify the speed of each on board. Port all of each are numbered. It will also tell you which port are connected to the AMD or Intel platform hubs rather than the auxiliary SATA controllers. These are usually the ports with the lowest numbers. Use the AMD or Intel ports first. Now we need to make sure everything can draw power from the PSU with modular power supply. Connect cable first to the PSU and then to the appropriate components one at a time. The power supply socket should be to accept only the right leads. Start with the motherboard's primary power connector. Line up with a clip on the plug with the tab on the outside of the motherboard socket. If the connector doesn't slide into the socket smoothly, try to flipping it around. Next, attach to the auxiliary 12-volt connector, which will use 4 or 8 pins depending on the board. PSU cables often have the highest number of pins that might be required by a given socket, but the end plugs can be split to accommodate lower pin counts. Sometimes the 12-volt cable is too short to thread it behind the motherboard tray. Cable extensions are available, or you should string the cable across the top of the motherboard. Most graphic cards require external power in the form of 1 or 2 PCIe connectors or needs to 6-pin connectors. If your PSU don't have enough PCIe connectors for your graphic cards, or if the plug supply don't have enough pins, check the graphic card box for an adapter. Finally, attach the SATA power cables to the SSDs and hard drive and the optical drive. We're going to connect the 650D's docking station to the power supply too. With everything connected, it's time to tie up the loose ends. Finally, use the zip ties to neatly arrange cabling. It's best bundle adjustment cables rather than dealing with them individually. Keep a low profile behind the motherboard tray, otherwise the right side panel will bulge out when you have a traditional PSU that lacks modular cables. Bundle the unused leads and stock them somewhere that won't be block the airflow. Before we move to the final touches, we're going to perform a quick upgrade. We wouldn't have recommended water cooling to inexperienced builders a few years ago, but newer closed-loop coolers are sealed at the factory, reducing the chance to leaks. They're also very easy to install. The radiator usually attaches to a case's 120mm fan mount, which are 650D conveniently has right next to the CPU socket. Most water coolers are bolted on the CPU using custom mounting brackets and block plates. If your case's motherboard tray doesn't have a cutout under the socket, you'll need to remove the board since each cooler's mounting mechanism is slightly different. Consult the manual before installation. Remove both existing heatsink and the rear fan before installing the water cooler. If this upgrade is being performed on a system you've been using, make sure to unplug the power cord. The H80 is supposed to be attached first to the case's rear panel and then to the socket. Corsair recommends orienting the dual fans to suck air into the case and over the radiator and will oblique since the 650D has a massive exhaust fan up top. We don't necessarily need more blowing out of the case. Once the radiator and fans are connected, install the CPU block. Be sure to clean up any old thermal compound of the CPU before applying a new coat for that water cooler. When the block is secure, connect the cooler's fan plugs. The H80's fans attach directly to the block, which has its own leads that plug into the motherboard, CPU fan header, and a 4-pin Molex connector for the PSU. With all the internal components installed, it's time to attach the side panels and connect the external peripherals. Move the case to its desired location before hooking up the keyboard, mouse, monitor, and audio. Your keyboard and mouse likely have USB connectors. Use the ports in the rear cluster and avoid ones with blue internal tabs if you can. Keyboard and mice don't need USB 3. Next, we'll attach a networking cable to the motherboard's Gigabit Ethernet port. The other end of this cable should run directly to your router, modem, or internet gateway. Wired network offer much higher transfer rate than wireless ones, but a Wi-Fi is still fast enough for most internet connections. The PHD77B has built-in Wi-Fi, so we'll attach the included antenna. Connect the monitor to the graphics card rather than to the motherboard, which has its own collection of video outs. If your monitor has only an analog VGA input recognizable from computers dating back to the 80s, you might be able to find another adapter in the graphic card box. RSU's ProArt PA246Q monitor has 3 digital inputs: DisplayPort, HDMI, and DVI. HDMI and DisplayPort are capable of carrying audio signals alongside video, which can sometimes cause Windows to mistakenly set the monitor as the primary audio output. Since most folks will probably use separate speakers or headphones, we recommended DVI. If you're running a sound card, be sure to use its audio port instead of the ones we're going to plug in Asus Vulkan A and C headset to the front panel ports, which we've already connected to some our sound card. Last connection to make is power from the wall socket. The necessary cable should be included with the PSU. Remember to flip the master power switch at one back of PSU before attempting to turn on the system. Otherwise known as the BIOS or UEFI, motherboard firm or controls numerous system variable. Getting into interface typically requires hitting a specific key, often delete or F2, during the first few seconds after powering on the system. The flash screen that pops up the boot will indicate which key needs to be pressed. The new generation of firmware implementations have rich graphical interfaces, complete the mouse support. Each motherboard maker has a different interface style, and we can walk you through to that. All settings will be tweaking are fairly consistent from onboard to the next. First, we're going to update the motherboard's firmware. Most firmware are integrated flashing utility. You can download the latest release for your specific model from the manufacturer's website. Put the firmware file on a USB thumb drive connected to the system and boot into the firmware interface. From there, you should be able to launch the flashing utility and select the firmware file on the thumb drive. Make sure the system doesn't lose power during the flashing process, otherwise your motherboard might get hosed. With the firmware up to date, we can move on to tweaking a few settings. The firmware should have a default profile, you can revert back into order in order to erase any changes on our ASUS P8Z77V motherboard. Most of the settings are confined to the advanced section of the interface. We'll start by checking the CPU's power management features, which keep the chip from drawing too much juice at idle. If you have all AMD based rig, make sure cool and quiet is enabled on Intel systems. Turn on speed stack. Also make sure turbo is enabled for both AMD and Intel processor. This will raise the CPU clock speed when thermal from it. ASUS has revamped Intel motherboards have a multi-core enhancement features that overlocks the CPU by default. Modern motherboards do a pretty good job of setting the right memory speed and timings based on the modules installed. Some modules like our Corsair Dominators have their speed of and timings programmed into special XMP profile that can be accessed via the firmware. Unless you know what the case latency means, stick with the Auto XMP profile. Next, navigate to the storage section of the firmware. Make sure the serial ATH controller is set to the HCI mode, which enables command queuing. Also enables hot plugging for any SATA ports you might want to swap drives while the system is still running. Will enable hot plugging for SATA ports associated with the case's drive dock. Take a moment to set the boot order. If the operating system will be installed from the DVD, set the system's optical drive as the primary boot device. If you're installing the operating system from a thumb drive, set that as the primary boot device to ensure the thumb drive is available as boot option connected before powering the system. Now check the secondary boot device. The system has selected the hard drive by default. Now we're gonna change that as the SSD. Most firmware has a separate menu for changing the hard drive boot priority. Fan controls are one of where there's a lot of variety in the motherboard firmware. Most boards should offer some kind of smart setting for the CPU. Our P8Z77V has a couple of preset profiles in addition to the ability to tweak temperature ranges and fan speeds manually. Some motherboard firmwares features a fan type setting designed to differentiate between DC and PWM fans. We recommend Windows for a desktop PC. We're going to use Windows 8 since it's Microsoft's latest OS and the one most likely to be installed on new builds. Early in the installation process, you'll be asked where to install Windows. Make sure you install the OS up to the SSD. Windows should reside on the fastest drive in the system. The selection menu doesn't list the drives by name, but it's necessary to spot our new tried SSD smaller capacity. Once the destination drive has been selected, the installation routine does its thing, rebooting as necessary. After prompting the user to select a computer name and color scheme, Windows 8 offers express and custom install options. We recommend the latter, which lets you enable the various OS features depending on your preferences. When you reach the modern UI start screen, it's time to start upgrading the drivers. First, install the latest platform drivers, also known as the chipset drivers for the motherboard. These are best downloaded directly from AMD or Intel. Drivers for the motherboard's integrated networking adapter plus any auxiliary peripherals like USB or serial ATA controllers can be downloaded from the motherboard maker's website. If you're without an internet connection entirely or need to install the board's networking driver to get online, there is a driver disk on the box. These drivers may not be the latest version, but they should work. The graphics card will come with its own driver disk. Ignore it and grab the latest drivers from AMD or Nvidia depending on whether you have a Radeon or a GeForce. Graphics drivers are updated frequently. If you're a gamer, it's worth staying on the top of the latest releases. PC audio tends to move slower than the graphics. Still, we advise checking to see if your sound card's manufacturer has newer drivers than what's on the included CD. If you're using the motherboard's integrated audio, download the appropriate drivers from the board maker's website. Once the all drivers are updated, launch the Windows Device Manager. The quickest way is by right-clicking the hot corner in the bottom left of the screen. If all the drivers are installed correctly, the device manager window should look a little like the one in the picture above. Any devices that require additional attention will be marked by yellow triangular icons with exclamation point. Finally, fire up Windows Update and download the latest patches for the operating system. Windows will want to install updates during the PC's next scheduled maintenance period, but since the new build, it's best to apply update right